Finally, Unholy Death Knight has been reworked with the class tree and the spec tree together with the hero talents are playable now on alpha, which we did, and the class as a whole feels so much better, feels revitalized with new powers going to the war within, and you will find out how, why, which, and who in this video. Let's start off with the class talents that have changed quite a bit in the actual tree, and you will notice if you look at the screen right now that a lot of the positions have been swapped, which makes it a much more improved talent tree to actually go through as a Death Knight and allows you to actually have options now to be valuable to your group. First of all, you will notice that Soul Reaper is just on the middle right side of the talent tree and no longer a capstone, considering that, at least for Unholy, Soul Reaper has been a pretty locked in talent to get, and now it's way easier to get too. You'll also notice that Empowered Rune Weapon is gone, very important, and it's now only a Frost Death Knight thing, and once Frost is reworked, we'll get to that as well, but that just frees up your capstones to not actually be damage capstones anymore, and it's all pure utility, because sure, Abomination Limb still does some damage, but its resource generation has been taken away, and the damage is kind of mediocre, so now you are actually incentivized to use it for pure utility purposes instead of actually forcing you to hold a DPS cooldown just because your raid needs your grippy hands 30 seconds later to grab all those Farok ads. No more, this is just grips. And with that out of the way, let's talk the biggest culprit that's responsible for this rework is Cleaving Strikes, because we know they've said that before, and Cleaving Strikes now will apply to 4 seconds after you leave your Death and Decay, essentially extending your Cleaving Strikes window to you also dodging mechanics because you have to move out of your Death and Decay, making AoE a lot easier to do. Now, granted, this is kind of not the rework a lot of people were hoping. We were hoping that we would just not be stuck to a ground effect anymore, since that hasn't been fun for any of the specs in the game so far, and it has been so not fun that Red Paladin completely deleted Consecration from its spells and just made it passive into all other spells, period, and also deleting the Consecration gameplay that it used to have in 10.0. Sadly, this is still a thing for Unholy DK, and it might still go away because the rework is not yet final, but the changes that it has so far just makes it way better. Part of the rework as well, as you might see that a lot of talents have been moved around, are also talents that are now one-pointers. Talents like Veteran of the First War, Third War actually, which is a one-pointer gain 20% more stamina. And a lot of this has been made throughout the tree, and also nodes are more accessible. Nodes like Wraith Walk, which you can get to way easier, and you can path from it to actually valuable talents, like Blood Scent, which gives you 5% leech, almost a guaranteed lock-in pick. Some talents that are still kind of mandatory are on the lower row, which are Rune Mastery and Death's Echo. Rune Mastery is actually the only damage node on this row, but it's also a very good damage node, and it leads into Abomination Limb. You still have to take Subduing Grasp, which is a new talent, and that's debatable how useful it is for Unholy, since normally you don't get hit by targets you grip because you're not usually the tank. That might be more for a Blood Decay thing. And the fact that it costs 2 points to get into Abomination Limb, once again, as anything but Blood Decay, might be tad annoying to do, and it doesn't really have any value outside of PvP and maybe solo world content. On the plus side, we do have new talents on the bottom right hand side of the tree. Osmosis is a 2-pointer that gives Anti-Magic Shell the functionality of increasing the healing that you receive for its duration by 25% if you put both of those 2 points in. Once again, this is questionable how good it is for Unholy, since when you press Anti-Magic Shell, one of two things is likely to happen, which are usually the desired outcomes. Either you immune a mechanic, which kind of implies that you're not really taking any damage, or very little if at that, or if you are actually absorbing damage, you're likely going to be absorbing it quicker than any healing could reliably take advantage of the increased throughput. Now, you could also say that this is once again for Blood Decay, because Blood Decay can reliably press Anti-Magic Shell and then immediately Death Strike for 25% more healing, which for Blood Decay, that is giga good. Oh my god, that would make Death Strike so fat, especially if you're low HP. Once again, another 2-point node that doesn't really seem to have very much to do with the DPS DK, so that feels a little bit But the capstones, however, are very interesting, and they're both new talents. Might have been talents in the past, but now they're new, and one of them is Null Magic, where it increases the magic damage reduction that you have by 10%, and the duration of harmful magic effects against you are reduced by 35%. First of all, on paper, that is insane how good it is. You passively take 10% less magic damage, and all of the magic effects last 35% less. That is so much tankiness against magic damage. It's unreal, so unreal that I'm not very convinced that this is going to make it into the live with these exact numbers. Things will change because that would just make DKs almost unkillable by magic damage. The alternative, which is the cooler looking one, is Vestigial Shell. Casting Anti-Magic Shell grants 2 nearby allies a lesser anti-magic shell that absorbs magic damage and reduces the duration of magic effects by 50%. Now, this is all just tuning, but to probably get a better sense of how strong this is, the anti-magic shell that you give to other people is 20% of your actual value in terms of the absorb amount. This, of course, has a lot of value in raids. Whenever an AoE damage mechanic happens, you and 2 other targets will 100% survive it, especially if you're topped off, since you will actually absorb a significant chunk of magic damage that normally just one-shots people. The other thing is that it's just passive sustain that just works throughout the combat, especially if you just use anti-magic shell more or less on cooldown when constant magic damage happens. And being able to save 2 nerds is always really cool. The last 2 new talents that I want to mention are just beneath Blinding Sleet, which are Ice Prison and Proliferating Chill. Ice Prison makes Chains of Ice root targets for 4 seconds and have a 12-second cooldown, and Proliferating Chill makes Chains of Ice affect 1 additional target. The root will likely be valuable in very niche situations in both Mythic Plus or raids. It mostly depends on the combat encounters, since when you really need a root in any of the encounters in PvE, you would need a much longer root like Mass Entanglement or actually Entangling Roots. 4 seconds is usually not enough to warrant at least 1 talent point into it. It feels like it's a PvP thing, which if that's the case, then that's great, because you actually don't need to put any points into these 2 talents if you just want to get to stuff like Gloom Ward or Suppression, because of all the additional pathing that has been made into the talent tree, which is probably the best thing that has happened, period, since more options is always better. Just like how we have options with the Patreons that are supporting the content and sponsoring this video. No joke, Patreons are actually making it possible for us to do more content and raise, of course, the quality of our content consistently across the board, all throughout the alpha of The War Within. And if you like the content we do and you want to support us a little bit more, you can check the Patreons down below. Not only will you be making this content possible and make us be less reliant on YouTube ad revenue, but you'll also have access to unique goodies that only Patreons have, like 4K wallpapers with your transmog on them. I mean, look how cool these look, man. Fuck, I have one for myself as well. And you'll also have access to bloopers, to Patreon podcasts, early release of videos and things like that. So check it out, maybe see if it's for you. If not, then let's just go into the actual spec rework for Unholy, which has seen tremendous changes in terms of the overall mechanics. There still are some things that need to be changed, and we will get to that as well. First of all, what you might notice is that the cooldown for Dark Transformation and Apocalypse has been reduced to 45 seconds, and as a byproduct, the talent Army of the Damned and any other cooldown reduction mechanics have been taken away from Unholy, giving you the ability to actually pair cooldowns just by default and not having to be reliant on your rotation, which was something that I personally liked, but I can appreciate the fact that they're more accessible now. Also, because Army of the Damned has been taken away, Army of the Dead is now flat 3 minutes cooldown and no longer an 8-minute cooldown, which was crazy. Or was it a 5-minute? Doesn't matter. Now it's 3 minutes, just like every other cooldown in the game. That just makes pairing them up way easier. Oh, and now instead of Army of the Damned, we have Raise Abomination, which replaces Army of the Dead. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown, it applies Fester Wounds around and Virulent Plague to every enemy around it for as long as it is up, making it most likely an ideal choice in Mythic Plus just because of the shorter cooldown. It will align better with most packs in the dungeon and of course your other cooldowns, but the AoE component of it might just be the thing that saves you from always having to rely on Unholy Blight. And it's a fucking abomination. Did I mention that? God damn, look at that beauty. Sudden Doom has also received a big crit component to its proc, so now when you consume Sudden Doom, the Death Coil or Epidemic is guaranteed to be a critical strike, which gives a lot more power to the talent because you don't normally talent into crit, so getting free guaranteed crits always feels really good. And to add more love to Sudden Doom playstyles, we have two talents that kind of work really well with each other. Menacing Magus is your current tier set where your Magus of the Dead now shoot Shadow Bolt volleys at up to 4 nearby enemies and not just at one target. This of course doesn't really pair with Sudden Doom until you see the choice node of Summon Gargoyle and Doom Bidding, which makes consuming Sudden Doom call upon a Magus of the Dead to assist you for 8 seconds. And if you pair this up with Menacing Magus, you essentially call an AoE Magus of the Dead every time you have Sudden Doom procs. And you will have quite a few Sudden Doom procs. And that just feels crazy good in AoE and gives you an option to go into the Unholy Aura and Commander of the Dead without having to force Summon Gargoyle onto you. Although being able to take those talents is still questionable, and we will get to that later into the video. One quick note to make, because I feel like this feedback cannot be overstated enough: Defile still obstructs mechanics on the ground. Defile is a cool fantasy mechanic to play with, but it still makes it impossible to see swirlies, and this has killed more DKs than actual mechanics. And outside of all of the talents being moved around just to make building and pathing more cohesive, Festiermind has changed how it works, where now it no longer just triggers a flat 20 seconds buff window where you just want to stack as many stacks in, but now each individual Festiermind buff has its own 20 seconds duration, and they all expire individually based on when you proc them, making this feel way more like Guardian Druid's Iron Fur and give you much more uptime on your strength window. And hopefully maybe this in the future can promote some wound playstyles that would make it way more interesting to play Festiermind. However, it still feels like talents like Pestilence might still be dead unless they change how that works. Because Vile Contagion has also been addressed, lowering it to 45 seconds cooldown, which makes me think that they really want us to play Vile Contagion because it's a really cool talent. Not to mention that Bursting Swords and Ebon Fever are no longer a choice node. You can actually pick both those to play a Wound Burst Disease build. And with that, we can address the hero talent, starting with the one that actually feels so much better to play with and is not the one you think, and it is actually Sand Lion. Sand Lion probably also suffers from the alpha syndrome, where if you are a content creator or anybody with alpha access and you play any type of spec, you will start with almost no haste whatsoever. And the fact that Sand Lion gives you 10% base haste is incredible. First of all, if you don't know what Sand Lion does, it revolves around Vampiric Strike. Your Death Coil, Epidemic, and Death Strike have a 10% chance to make your next Heart Strike or Scorch Strike become Vampiric Strike. Vampiric Strikes heal you for 5% of your maximum health and grant you Essence of the Blood Queen, which is what you will be interested in. This increases your haste by 1.5%, all the way up to 7.5% baseline. That will also change with Frenzied Bloodthirst, making Essence of the Blood Queen stack 2 additional times and increase the damage of your Death Coil and Death Strike by 2% per stack, raising the haste levels to 10.5%. Now, whether this will change your proclivity to stack a lot of haste and make you maybe want versatility or crit is still left to be simmed for, but you will start with baseline 10% more haste once you get to level 80 in the War Within, so you won't feel like you're so behind everybody else, because Unholy just does not kick off until you have a lot of haste. Not to mention that with Gift of the Sand Lane, the capstone makes it so that while Dark Transformation is active, you gain Gift of the Sand Lane. Gift of the Sand Lane increases the effectiveness of your Essence of the Blood Queen by 100%, and Vampiric Strike replaces your Heart Strike and Scorch Strike for the duration. So you will have uptime to this 100% of the time, giving you so much haste and so much rotational satisfaction. Two cool utility talents that make Sand Lane a very interesting addition to your group, and you will be happy to be playing this year. Talents are, first of all, Vampiric Aura, increasing your leech by 3%, and while Lichborn is active, that buff is increased by 100%, and it also affects 4 nearby allies, effectively giving your entire party 6% leech on top of what leech they already have, and that is very strong and gives a lot of sustain in Mythic Plus dungeons, and obviously it can be very valuable in raids as well. The other thing is definitely vampiric speed. That's advanced and Wraith Walk movement speed bonuses are increased by 10%, and when you activate these, you'll give 4 nearby allies 20% more movement speed for 5 seconds. Suffice to say that this is a little tiny stampeding roar that Blood DKs can give to their groups, and just, I say Blood DKs, but it's also Unholy DKs. I can't, dude, if you look at it, it's blood, okay? It looks like blood. It is blood. All the talents are red, okay? I am saved. This is my excuse. Now, there are some underlying issues with Sand Lane that the Unholy DK rework is trying to fix that Sand Lane actually exacerbates, and that is the resource bloat that DK has, period. Because of talents like Visceral Regeneration, your Heart Strike and Scorch Strike have 3% chance per stack of Essence of the Blood Queen to refund the rune. Vampiric Strike doubles the chance to refund the rune. And if you look at how I am playing on Alpha, you might think, dude, Jesus, Flame feels like a very bad DK. Look at all the resources he's over flooding. And you might be right, but also it's freaking impossible to spend all of your resources because you get Vampiric Strike procs so often, because they constantly give you runes back, because they constantly generate runic power, and you don't have time to spend all of that runic power if you want to stack your Essence of the Blood Queen to insane amounts and just get way more haste. I don't know how that will change. I do hope that resources are made to matter, because not caring about resources is something that Death Knight unfortunately has for Unholy and most likely for Frost as well. Thankfully, Frost doesn't have to play Sandline, because Jesus, this might be incredibly good for Blood DK, but Unholy still needs some looking at when it comes to resource economy. And with Sandline, it just feels like you don't really care about resources at all, and that's not really how you want to play a spec, because that's definitely not the case with Rider of the Apocalypse. The visually superior and thematically cooler of the hero talents, the coolest that there is also one of the most pacifist, that is a word, talent tree in existence. It all happens behind the scenes. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad talent tree, because the cosmetic effect of it is basically what everybody has been asking for when they talked about, I want my spells to look different type things with Unholy DK, and it does look fucking amazing. Seeing all of the riders riding with you in combat, seeing the Death and Decay move around, seeing Trollbane destroy with the Chains of Ice or whatever it has in AoE, that is crazy good. But Rider of the Apocalypse just smooths out the gameplay of Unholy and is pretty much elevating everything that you love about Unholy. There's one particular talent that I do want to talk about, well, there's two, but one of which is Mossworn Menace, which reduces the cooldown of Unholy Blight by 15 seconds and Death and Decay by 10. Suffice to say, reducing the cooldown of Death and Decay by 10 seconds is incredibly good, and if you played Defile, it would get Defile down to 15 seconds, which will give you insane uptime on AoE and most likely much higher uptime on your Defile buff. I don't know if this will actually make Defile mandatory, because it kind of feels like you want Unholy Blight every 30 seconds for the increase in damage it does. It also will make Unholy Blight not align with Dark Transformation and Apocalypse anymore, which is weird considering that the whole purpose of reducing the talents that reduce cooldown reduction in the spec tree has been to make cooldowns align better and not be cumbersome. Now this kind of just goes against that, so I'm not sure what this means. It also kind of feels like you want to play diseases with Rider of the Apocalypse, and judging by the class rework, it still feels like you're just trying to play diseases everywhere, since diseases just feel superior to everything else. But unsurprisingly, and no longer a meme, the talent that has made me look at Unholy totally different is the Mount talent, and that's not on a Paler horse as you might think, as I would have thought, because it just didn't really work on Alpha. Although the Ashka Head dungeons that we had access to this week were just open dungeons and you could mount all the way, meaning that normally when the dungeons hit the server, you should be able to be 100% mounted the entire time you're in the dungeon, which would be cool on its own. But what actually changed it was Death Charge. Having access to a mount for 10 seconds on 2 charges, because you will be playing Death's Echo, is incredible. How mobile you are and how it 100% changes how Unholy plays in combat. You will have to play for yourself to see exactly what I'm talking about. And this has been my overall impression of Unholy playing it on alpha, because it's a much funner and way cooler spec to play, caveating the fact that we still have 2 talents that are not yet implemented and we don't know what they are, so they could just add a lot more flavor to Unholy or fix a lot of the issues that I mentioned here in this video, considering that the pathing of Unholy is still a little bit weird and there's so many expensive gates in terms of talent points to reach your capstones, considering that Unholy Assault is probably a locked-in pick for the entire expansion, because having 20% flat damage across the board is always superior, not to mention it's downstream from Might. So that means that the points on the bottom left side of the talent tree are most likely locked in and you can never really swap from them unless they really giga buff Commander of the Dead and Super Strain. And still, despite this, Unholy is closing in the gap between it and the best spec in the game, which is Fire Mage. Fortunately or unfortunately, it sets the standards for the future of World of Warcraft gameplay, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to see our video, because it goes over everything that Fire Mage has going for it in the War Within and why it's the best spec.